Advanced Pivot Table. Ticket to Self-Service Dashboards. Pivot tables are such a great function in Excel, making it super easy and fast to build financial or operational reports. However, they are also notorious for being extremely rigid and inflexible. We cannot easily format them or even insert rows freely into the pivot tables. This course will show you a total of 18 hacks for pivot tables, pivot charts, slicers, and timelines so that you can confidently build a dynamic self-service dashboard in Excel. So without further ado, let's get started. Hierarchy of Excel techniques. Pivot table as a technique. As we illustrated in previous sessions, Excel modeling has 5 generations for the modeling techniques. First is hard link. Second, dynamic formulas such as SUMIF. Third gen, pivot tables, including pivot charts. Fourth, macro, for example, VBA or Visual Basic for applications. Fifth gen, Power BI, including Power Query and Power Pivot. So, pivot tables belongs to the third gen in modeling. It achieves what prior 2 generations cannot. So the question comes, when to pivot and when not to pivot. Do you use pivot tables when one can automate the workflow and complement dynamic formulas? Do not use pivot tables when there's a better way, for example, 5th gen in modeling, or lots of calculations are needed, for example, DAX formulas in Power Pivot. Before we move on to the course, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Lenny Wu. I'm a PD instructor at various online platforms. I received my MBA Finance from the George Washington University. I'm a CPA CGA from CPA Canada. I'm also a Certified Adaptive Insights Professional and a Certified Zero Accounting Partner. I sat as an examiner of IELTS, or International English Language Testing System, and was an exam trainer of TOEFL, or Test of English as a Foreign Language, GRE, or Graduate Record Examination, and GMAT, or Graduate Management Admission Test. I have over 22 years working with Microsoft Excel. I'm a modeling expert in Power Query, Power Pivot, and Power BI. I'm also a proponent of OCR, or one-click reporting, and SSR, or self-service reporting. Next, in response to some feedback from my students, I would like to share my thoughts on how this course is compared with other similar courses. This course is not an academic course like others that teaches all skills from A to Z, whether they are useful or obsolete, such as building a VBA to filter a list. It does not tell you which formulas or skills are mostly used at work. This course is a practical course where it capitalizes on my 20+ years professional experiences in financial reporting and modeling. It builds upon my 22+ years Excel and 5+ years Power Query experiences. It has the top crucial skills handpicked by me so that you can get your foot in the door and survive in the office environment. It focuses on business uses versus academic uses. For example, how to control your reporting period with the timeline. It opens doors to more opportunities and promotions at office. In summary, I'm not teaching you skills for the sake of teaching skills. I'm teaching you only the relevant skills that will automate your workload and get yourself Excel at work. What you will get from this course. At the end of the course, you will be able to understand crucial elements and skills in building a dashboard, recognize ways of building interconnected data models for pivot tables and Power Pivot. Discover 5 extreme pivot table hacks. Recognize differences between getPivotData formula and CubeValue formula. Last, understand 7 best practices of building pivot tables in a dashboard. Pivot table and self-service dashboard. First one, artificial intelligence function. It is not uncommon to see some artificial intelligence functions in modern Excel, and one of them is called recommended pivot tables inside the data tab. With recommended pivot tables, Excel can automatically provide you options for different types of pivot tables in order for you to slice and dice your data and get insights from the data. Now let's look at Excel for an example. In Excel, we have 4 tabs of data and 1 tab of forecast, which we're going to use later. For this session, let's look at the first 4 tabs. The first tab is related to orders or transactions. It has over 50,000 rows. The data includes order ID, order date, customer ID, product ID, quantity, sales or revenues, and total costs for the products. Second tab is related to product. We have category, subcategory, product name, unit price, and unit cost. Also, we have another table for customer. It has customer ID, customer name, segment, city, and state. Last one is the region. The region is based on the state name, and then country name, market, and a higher level, the region. Now, let's go to the Transactions tab or the Orders tab. And before we bring in the recommended pivot table, let's add more dimensions. For example, let's add in category by using the conventional VLOOKUP. Subcategory. And let's also bring region from the region tab. So let's use VLOOKUP. For the category, that belongs to the product. So let's use the product ID, comma, product ID. Category is the second column starting from product ID. So 2 and last 0 for false or exact match. Enter. Similarly, we can put in subcategory, state, and region into this data table. Alright, so let's double click the first 4 cells and copy it down. Now we are going to generate a pivot table based on this data. Now let's go to Insert. Rather than click Pivot Table, let's try Recommended Pivot Table and see what Excel has to bring to us. First is total sales by region, which we may need. And also second, let's also put in total sales by subcategory. So let's put in these 2. First one, all of a sudden, it generates a pivot table inside a new tab, and this one is called total sales by the region. Also, let's go back and insert another pivot table. For example, this time the total sales by subcategory. Let's double click and click OK. And the second pivot table is generated in a separate tab. So this one is the total sales by category and subcategory. Now we have learned how to use the AI functions of Excel to generate recommended pivot tables for you. Perfect. The second element of a self-service dashboard is a pivot chart. It is very much like conventional chart, except that for regular chart, they have to be driven by the data behind them. But for a pivot chart, it has to be driven by a pivot table. In another word, a pivot chart has to go with a pivot table. Now let's look at Excel for the example. So in Excel, we have two ways of adding a pivot chart. We can go to the table, go to Insert. So rather than click Pivot Table, we can go to Charts, Pivot Chart. There are two options. One is simply insert a pivot chart. The other one is pivot chart and pivot table. However, based on my observation, both options will give you the same result, meaning open a tab that has both pivot chart and pivot table. For example, let's click pivot chart. The data range is exactly what is on this tab, and we put the pivot table and pivot charts in a new tab. Now we have a pivot chart and a pivot table screen. Just as usual, we can drag and drop cells by region. Done. Or another way to drop the pivot chart is to go to your pivot table and go to Insert. Then you have the pivot chart option. You do not need to add another pivot table again because you already have the pivot table. Simply click Pivot Chart, select the chart type, in this case the column chart, and then click OK. Both options will give you the same result. Perfect.